Welcome to Research Insights with Elite Mind Academy. Today, we are looking at music, work, and well-being. So in Research Insights with Elite Mind Academy, we try and explore topics that relate to the organizational well-being industry, but maybe something that's slightly niche or slightly kind of outside of the norm, but also things that stay behind closed doors in this industry. So today we're looking at music, we're looking at how it can affect our experience of work, but also how it affects our well-being generally. And we are joined by expert guests discussing these topics today. We have Dina Jan. Dina is a mental health practitioner. She is also a music lover herself and has brought this into her work, using music to help people support and share their experiences with difficult emotions and mental health issues. And we also have Dawson, who is a musician himself. He will be explaining and giving us a bit of insight into what's actually going on behind the scenes in music. What is it about music that might be affecting us in different ways or creating certain moods, and also sharing his experience working in a creative industry where there's music all around and how that might affect him. So welcome both of you. Sorry, and I'm Valentina. I always forget to introduce myself. I'm Valentina. I am Head of Insights and Impact at Elite Mind Academy. Okay, I think that's all the introductions done. We better get into the content. So yeah, today we're kind of looking at music, work, and well-being. And I guess I'd just love to hear maybe from either of you, what are the immediate thoughts that kind of come to mind when you think about these things? We have this question in the title, should we have music in offices? And we'll kind of maybe come to a conclusion with that a bit later on. But what's been your experience with music and work?
Do you want to start, Cameron, or do you want me to start? I don't mind.
I suppose for me, because music is my job, it's maybe a little bit difficult to answer, because it is literally everything I do.
The whole thing, yeah, everything.
It's the whole thing, yeah. I mean, obviously, there's a lot that comes with it, like just general admin of being a self-employed person or trying to organize my life, which is as difficult as any other job.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I suppose it's because it's obviously such a creative outlet. Sometimes it doesn't necessarily feel like a job, and sometimes it really, really feels like a job.
I bet.
So yeah, the lines are really blurred, I suppose, in this example. But I'm still a heavy music lover, So I guess in terms of like listening to music while doing things that aren't necessarily creative output or whatever, because it's quite a span of things, I guess, working music. Like some of it is creative, but some of it's kind of less creative. Sometimes the point isn't to be creative. So.
And that's interesting. You've highlighted something there kind of about how we use music when we're working creatively or not creatively. Dina, what's your experience of listening to music while working? Is it something that you do? How do you find that affects you? Also, just quickly before you answer, for anyone who's tuned in, please feel free to ask us some questions in the chat, share your thoughts, your experiences with music at work. If you've had any conflicts around music at work, if it's been something that's brought you together, something that helps you focus, something that helps you manage your emotions in a work environment or a personal environment, please just let us know all of that in the chat. Over to you, Dino. Kind of what's your experience with listening to music, let's say, at work, before we get onto how you use it in your work?
Mm-hmm. Well, in my experience, like I love listening to music throughout the course of my day and at different intervals. But for me, I struggle to, if I need to really focus on a task, especially if it's something like reading or particular types of admin, it's really hard to actually focus on that particular task if I'm listening to music with lyrics. But if it's without lyrics, sort of focus music or ambient music, things like this, then it's a lot easier. And generally, I mean, I'd love to use music in my client sessions when I'm working with people who are struggling with their mental health. However, that wouldn't necessarily work. So unfortunately, I can't do that. But there are ways in which I've been able to weave, like, listening to music as a group, and sort of triggered conversations around music, which has been really helpful and therapeutic, I think. But not necessarily listening to them in one-to-one sessions, but in group sessions and workshops. That's different.
Oh, amazing. That's really interesting. And kind of you touched on there a little bit about how music can help you focus, but also how it might help people share in group settings. And so maybe we'll just kind of go into a little bit of a background about what's actually going on here when music is affecting us and why we feel, why it might help us focus, why it might help us open up or share things. And I mean, there's a huge connection between music and emotion, right? So music can create different emotions in us and can stimulate us to feel different things. And actually, kind of music can affect and can encourage blood flow to almost all regions of the brain, depending on what the atmosphere or kind of type of music is. Dina, you mentioned not wanting always to have lyrics in music that helps you focus, and actually that's supported by a lot of research into this area, saying that there was a survey done actually by Sonos and Apple Music, but no doubt wanting to promote the use of music, but it aligns with other studies, and I think there was one that you found as well, Dina. But 77% of employees reported improved focus and productivity when listening to music while working. But the choice is really important. So upbeat instrumental music or lyric-free music are often recommended to minimize distraction while enhancing concentration. What did you find about that, Dina?
Oh, that is a very good question. I was just then thinking about the brain then, because I found something really interesting about how music can actually activate multiple different areas of the brain, which I found really interesting. And it's often in like a sequential order as well. So it starts with the auditory cortex, which analyzes the sound, and then the frontal regions process the structure, then the mesolimbic system, which is involved in arousal and pleasure and activates and produces dopamine, is involved. And then dopamine activates the nucleus accumbens and the cerebellum, and the basal ganglia then process the rhythm and the meter. So there's lots going on basically. But in terms of like movement, that's the final stage of where we're sort of linking the brain with how we then respond to the music. So that's really interesting.
That's fascinating. And there's I think there was research to say as well, it's interesting you talk about kind of those different parts of the brain and kind of how it goes through that structure and what it's processing. And you mentioned how music can trigger or can release dopamine. And that I think can be quite crucial in some of these dynamics, because dopamine is one of those incredible kind of neurotransmitters that affects so many different parts of our functioning as humans. So it influences, like you mentioned, movement. I mean, we're probably all familiar with that response to music, but also learning, motivation, your heart rate and your blood vessel function, even your kidney function, obviously your mood we're more aware of, but also attention, and that somewhat relates to pain processing as well. So my mind is kind of running wild here with all the different ways that we could then use music to kind of as a therapeutic intervention as well. There's, I think, research to say that people with Alzheimer's who listen to music on a daily basis had a much improved state when compared to those who didn't listen to music. And that's partially because of how it affects the brain, having high levels of dopamine, and what the relationship between that and memory. So when we think about, like, we remember these experiences, sometimes they might seem inane, but from our childhood and our teenage years, like we might remember the lyrics to a song that we listened to as a teenager, like from start to finish, but we can't remember what's on our shopping list that we wrote 5 minutes ago. And that's because we have this emotional connection with memory. And music has the power to stimulate emotion in us and have heightened emotional states. And if we're doing that and associating it with other things that we want to remember, then the chances are we are more likely to remember them. I'm interested from your perspective, Cameron. So if we've been talking a little bit about music and emotion, and from your experience as someone who creates music, what are the kinds of things in the music itself that might influence what emotion is then produced by listening to it?
I think there's like there's a lot in it on why music affects people differently, and why different music, why for some people instrumental ambient sort of lyricless music can be easier to work with because of obviously an absence of other words where you're trying to think about words, but for some people they just want high energy chart topping pop, because it just makes them feel really good, I suppose. So I think there's so much in it. There's so much kind of like tribalism in music as well, isn't there? Right, like people sort of connecting parts of who they are to sort of different sounds, to different whether it's like an electric guitar or a drum machine or whatever. There's like people identify so much with music in so many different ways, and that comes to the memory thing as well, of talking about certain songs will take people to certain places, and I guess, yeah, why is that? I guess a lot of it could be in the harmony. It could also be in the lyrics. And some people just listen to lyrics. I think for some people, music is just lyrics. They're not really too fussed about anything else going on around that, which is cool. And then for some people, it's the opposite. Some people can never learn the lyrics to a song because they're not really thinking about it. You've got mates that, you're listening to the same song and you hear their version of what the lyrics are, and it's just not.
Yeah. But then there's something in the instrumentals that's triggering.
Yeah, it's not as important.
Yeah.
Yeah, the words aren't as important. It's the other stuff, so it's like, why do we have sort of synapses going off when we hear certain things? I think a lot of it is tension and release. It's like, yeah, it corresponds to, I suppose, how you're feeling, or the kind of, I think sometimes people don't like too much tension. So if I listen to stuff that doesn't involve too much, okay, what am I talking about when I'm talking about tension and release? I guess like if you think of like a chord, I'm going to play this keyboard now. I think
okay. Go on.
So if you take like a chord, let's do this one. Okay, so on its own, it sounds kind of horrible, doesn't it? Or not horrible, it's just kind of dark, maybe mysterious. But it's how it resolves to, which is what feels good. That relief feels good. You're both smiling. Do you know what I mean? It's like, so what is that chord's purpose? Is it to get to that nice chord that we just had? Do you know what I mean? It's how long you might stay on the other chord, or what you might do with that chord. Maybe you took that chord as the focus of the whole thing, and then you just have a really intense music. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So that tension and resolution and the kind of the spacing in between those can really affect our emotional experience of the music, and what that triggers in us, whether it may trigger a sense of tension in us, or whether it might trigger more of a sense of relief and stress reduction.
Yeah, I think it's like it's also how people, it's also kind of what you need from life. I feel like, if you think about like metal fans, people that are really into heavy metal, they're usually really, really sweet people when you meet them, because they kind of get all their aggression out listening to music, or going to a show where they're just physically going at each other, and then you might meet some pretty uptight people that listen to really, really chill music because they just need to that's their thing,
it's about changing your emotion and managing it.
Certainly. And I think that's kind of, you've sort of brought us on to one of the other things that we wanted to talk about here, was how can we then use music, like you say, so some people are naturally more highly strung, and then balance that with something more relaxing to counter that state, and vice versa. Someone who's more passive might listen to music that will stimulate them and motivate them. And there's kind of research to say that, depending on what type of music we listen to, we can really influence our brain states in different ways. So listening to something that's fast-paced, upbeat, such as pop or rock, can stimulate the release of adrenaline and therefore increase alertness and energy. And conversely, slow tempo music, classical music, or ambient music can promote relaxation and stress reduction. And Dina, from your perspective, as someone who kind of works in mental health and supports people to manage their emotions, how has music come into your work, or what's your perspective on the use of music to manage emotions personally?
Well, I think for me, I've used it in a few different settings, as I said, mainly in groups. So there's a group that I ran when I worked with people who experience psychosis at a recovery service. And literally everybody would attend every week, which was really lovely. And it really brought everybody together, firstly. And then there was this sort of sense of like shared collective emotional processing, because people were encouraged to share a song. We wouldn't listen to all of it, but we'd listen to a good chunk of it, and then we'd talk about it. So that I'd encourage that, or I'd invite that person to ask me what that brings up for them, what it means for them, what maybe memories that might evoke, or what emotions and how it helps them, what they like about it. And then other people could sort of chime in as they wanted and join in, and then the next person could talk about it. And it really encouraged not only this idea of being able to use music as a tool to help manage emotions or mental health, but also it meant that these people could connect over something that I think is a shared love for us as humans, actually. And what else was I going to say about this? The other thing I do as well is I run a managing emotions group, literally in the name, and we do a similar thing. So we hold like a music appreciation part of the session where, it's essentially the same thing, but we talk about how you can use music to actively. So first noticing how you feel, and then thinking about what kind of music you need, whether that's soothing music to bring yourself down if you're sort of in that fight flight sort of state, if you're feeling overwhelmed, if you're feeling too much, and so using soothing then to bring yourself down, or if you're feeling sort of numb or low or sort of dissociated, then you might want something to activate or energize you to bring you back up and be more sort of in the present. So I think that music can have many functions, but that's how I've used it in my work, and I use it in my one-to-one work as well, but mainly in the groups.
That's really interesting. So you say it kind of encouraged this sharing and a kind of emotional expression, maybe in a group that otherwise may not have shared those experiences with each other. And that kind of relates to this capacity for music to be experienced very subjectively, kind of as you mentioned earlier, Cameron, and in fact Rob commented as well on that, so that he loved that heavy metal fans are really nice people because they get all their aggression out in listening to music. And so there's that element of subjectivity with it. And so I wonder, kind of thinking, you also mentioned about this tribalism around music. And so music really does have this strong power to unite us in a shared emotional experience. And if we just kind of take that information and think about how we could potentially apply that in workspaces and offices, we sort of come back to this question of, should we have music in offices? And I think we're sort of starting to flesh this out a bit and answer it. And there may be some settings where it can be useful as something to unite or create a sense of belonging. There's, we notice when we look at history and religion, how music has been used to create shared experiences and a sense of belonging within these groups. Similarly, even when you go out, you listen to music, you go to a gig, you go to a nightclub, there's this sense of shared experience, emotional experience, but also creative experience and something about expression there. And as you beautifully said, Dina, in this group that you're running, it's this kind of very human love, this very human kind of capacity for engaging with music in that way and having it influence us. And I wonder, kind of another question here is, okay, so if we're thinking about using music in offices, we recognize the ability for music to lower cortisol levels actually and lower stress with particular types of music. That could be very useful in work settings when there are stressful things going on, or potentially you're going into a conflict meeting or a difficult negotiation meeting, things like that. And so I wonder, kind of, what are either of your thoughts or experiences there with using music to create the kind of desired atmosphere, say when engaging with someone or having a meeting, or orchestrating kind of the space in a way?
That's an interesting question. I'm just thinking about a piece of research that I saw actually, which
Mhm.
was around. So they asked employees to listen to music for a third of their working week,
Mhm.
and listening to a wide range of styles and artists. And what they often reported was that music helped them to engage in, and but also to escape from work.
Mm.
But it also helped them to like seal themselves off from the office environment. So something about it maybe being an escape, but then there's also some way that it can bring them back into the space. Um, uh, I also think, well, there's something else about, and there's something else about that where it's just I think depending on the style that they listen to, that then affected their mood and how they were able to engage with clients and also with staff members. And actually, I'm thinking about a different study as well that was again about how I think it reduced sort of aggression in people who worked in a very particular field. I'm just going to try and find it.
Yeah, no problem. That's really interesting, though. And actually, Cameron, I wonder, when we were talking before, there was
I have an example.
yeah, you had a really
Yeah,
nice
sure.
example from your experience, and I think this is probably a lot more common in your industry, and so it's kind of, yeah, ideal setting.
So my cat's just rocked up, feeling extremely needy.
Oh, it's not a bad thing.
Um, yeah, I worked with a tour manager in the US a couple of years back that he would always find, he'd either find like an extra sort of dressing room backstage, or he'd just make a little table, and he would play really, really chilled, but usually Japanese ambient music, and then he'd have a little candle that he lit. And he only sort of told us why, but no one really questioned it. And then halfway through the tour, he sort of, we realized he did it because being a tour manager is a really stressful job, and you're always going to get people sort of coming to you first with any issues that they might have, whether that's the venue or the band, or could literally be anyone. So he always finds that it sort of instantly chills people out if they've got, like if they're kind of ending up in a really ambient space. It kind of feels really strange to be angry and aggressive when you're in like a really chill, it really highlights kind of how angry you are and how kind of unnecessary that might be.
That's really interesting. So not only does it kind of help influence people to be a bit calmer and more relaxed. I mean, we don't always have the benefit of having an adorable cat in our laps, so sometimes we have to use other tools. And so not only can it kind of help people to feel relaxed, but it also serves as a kind of comparison mood in a way to make people more aware of their emotional state as well, which I think is really interesting.
I don't know what it is, but it reminds. Well, I do know what it is. This conversation reminds me of, like, when you're on hold and that there's the classical music. It it does actually kind of work for me sometimes.
Yeah,
And I've been to McDonald's before in the middle of the night where they're playing classical music, and I'm just thinking, actually, yeah, this is a great idea.
depends on the whole music for me. There's definitely some that makes me even angrier, I think.
Yeah,
There are
depends.
some. I know they should be thinking about this when they're considering their hold music. But you're right, it's interesting. You know, we can see it in some public spaces, and you know, in our digital environment and all sorts, where we notice how music is being used to construct our mood and influence our mood. Yeah, we don't often see that in offices, and I'm kind of advocating here, I guess, for that to be used more. And I think sometimes, you know, the question here is, though, is that useful for everyone? And so I think where that can be quite an important question is when we think about having different spaces in an office and understanding different needs. So a lot of people might feel overwhelmed by too much background noise, and also it really depends on the task. So, you know, depending on what task you're doing, then you may or may not want music, or want different types of music. Likelihood is, if you're comfortable doing something because you're experienced with it, you're skilled, you're kind of on somewhat an autopilot, background music is more likely to help you achieve greater focus. However, if you're just learning to do something quite complex, or it's something that's very new to you, likelihood is you want to avoid music or kind of intrusive background noise, at least to begin with, so that you're able to kind of focus more easily on that, because it will be sort of requiring more of your brain. Similarly, if you're working on a boring task, or a particularly easy task, then music can enhance your attention by providing that additional stimulation to your brain, so that you don't start looking for that stimulation elsewhere. And there's also there's been studies to suggest, and I know from personal experience, that listening to the certain types of music can be really helpful for people with ADHD and focusing, because of creating that kind of background stimulation that then dampens the need to look elsewhere, away from the task at hand, for that additional stimulation. And I think lastly with that as well, kind of depending on what your emotional state is, as we've said, that can then influence what kind of music will actually help you work more efficiently in that moment. I'm just thinking as well, there was a really interesting study here as well. So there was a study that said that surgeons who listened to music in the operating room reported reduced stress levels and improved performance. So they were better surgeons and had better outcomes with their patients by having music on in the operating room. And I think that's amazing, you know, that we can see that in quite a high stakes environment. But actually, if we are to apply that on our everyday, then we could see productivity improve in the workplace. Even if we just change the culture around listening to music at work, it can be perceived as antisocial or unprofessional to have earphones in while we're at work, or to listen to your own personal music while you're working. But chances are, if someone is choosing to do that, it's because it's helping them, not hindering them. So I would kind of encourage that, and encourage sort of the use of music in those spaces for focus. But also can be motivational, and kind of, we talked about this, creating this sense of belonging. And it's not necessarily while we're working, but actually having music, different types of music, when we are having team days or social experiences at work, can really help with those relationships. Those working relationships can help you kind of bond with others. There's a study published in the Journal of Applied Psychology, said that playing music with positive lyrics in it, in a shared workspace, led to increased cooperation and pro-social behavior generally among employees. So music can serve as that social catalyst, but it can also promote that team cohesion and really foster a kind of positive atmosphere. No worries.
Sorry, every Thursday.
Oh, bless you. Talking about intrusive sounds. It's almost new.
Never on the dot either. So it's, you know, just to make sure that you're never know what's going to happen, just for maximum impact.
Oh, really brilliant. Of course, keep you on your toes, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so again, kind of Cameron, I want to ask you something about this. So thinking about kind of music and work, we're thinking about using music in, say, office-based jobs as a tool. But when music is your work, and we've been talking about how closely tied music is to our emotions and our brain states, I wonder for you, as someone who creates music, plays music, and kind of also in, you know, privately and with others, but also in a performance state, how do you find working in that domain affects your mood and your kind of state of mind generally?
It can be the most beautiful thing ever, because it's such a well, I mean, you know, just being, by the nature of being able to do it, to like make a living from my like passion slash, you know, hobby, is it's already a beautiful thing, and the chance to connect with people, you know, not using language, using a different language, using music. It's really cool, you know, because often, you know, like I've been playing with some people for absolutely years, and I know them in and out as people, you know, like over a decade with some people, and then sometimes you'll just meet people on the fly, you know, and you'll just be put in like a pickup band of whoever's about, you know. I mean, I had a gig last weekend, and I'd only met one of the people. I met the artist, I didn't know anyone else. You just got to socially get straight into it, and also musically get straight into it, and kind of work each other out. And that can be a really good thing. So yeah, it's a beautiful opportunity to be able to converse and have connections with people that aren't based in language, you know, in words. And yeah, it's great to be able to express myself, like whether that's my own music or my own band, or playing for artists, you know, because I kind of usually I've got to a place where I've kind of worked hard enough where I can actually just kind of offer my own input or play things my own way now, rather than being like someone you hire to play exactly what's on the record. I don't do that as much anymore. I kind of do more, you know, offering my own input, which is cool. So the creative expression is great, but there's obviously stuff like a lot of self-deprecation, which is difficult.
Because it's so personal, you know.
Personal, yeah, exactly. And it, you know, it's so interchangeable. You could be having a bad day, have a bad recording session, and then you feel terrible about, you know, and you just question everything. Or you can have a bad gig, or, you know, it's about trying to get over that, so you can just see it for what it is. But, you know, there's this saying, you hear all these kind of sayings when you're coming up, because I think music's as with all things, music's becoming a bit less like oppressed slash repressed now within people, you know, because the heads in, like, you know, they've been doing it for a long time, or even up to like the 90s and 2000s, they're all pretty obsessed with like, you're only as good as your last gig, saying stuff like that, you know, and all these kind of like really self-deprecating things that get into your head, and you're like, oh my God, yeah, that's so true. And really it's just everyone's oppressed and self-repressed, so they kind of make other people feel bad. And so there's a lot of that going on that you have to kind of work through, I guess. And also it's just like, it's not a very social, I mean, it's social in terms of its, you know, in terms of the nature of it, but it's not social. You know, it's quite hard for your own life. It's quite hard to balance relationships and friendships and seeing family, and, you know, because it really is a 24/7 job. Often it's like, you know, people assume it's weekends and evenings, but it's really not. It's like, you could get in, you know, you could be touring, get in from a show at 3, have to be up at 6 to go be at a radio station for 7 a.m. And you go from there to sound check on the next gig, and then you do, you know, it can literally just on and on and on for weeks, you know. So that part of it can get quite difficult, I think.
Yeah, I bet. And so there's that kind of unstructuredness about the industry and working as a freelance musician. that can make kind of drawing those boundaries and having that predictability and the sense of security and safety that comes from that predictability can make that quite hard. But then there's also the like you said really nicely, having this additional language through which to communicate with people and connect with people. And I think that that's really interesting, and actually kind of harks back a little bit to what you were saying, Dina, about this music group with your psychosis patients, and how that enabled some of this sharing and connection that otherwise may not have been there because of how we each relate to a song or some music differently, and often can speak to us and speak to others in very different ways.
Yeah, and I think it's really beautiful how that can happen as well in the presence of like an audience. So when you're performing and you kind of engender these shared emotions, and kind of how you feed, I guess the band members feed. I'm assuming I don't have the experience. I only have the
No, that's
experience
exactly
of
what it
being
is.
in the audience, but yeah, just kind of how you both feed off each other's energy. Well, they're feeding mainly off your energy as a musician, but yeah, I think some people say that that's like that could be interpreted as a sort of emotional contagion that you get from being in
Mm.
that kind of environment. Is that something that you resonate with, Cam?
I think the best gigs feel like when everyone was involved, every single person in the room was involved. And you know, and it's rare, but it happens. You just feel like everyone was united in that moment, and everyone has a shared percentage of why it was good. When you really feel like every single person is leaving fulfilled, and happy, and has really sort of given, because it's so hard to play. It's like stand-up comedy. If you're not getting it back, it's not going to be that funny. If you really have to like separate yourself and take yourself out of it, and that's never that fun. So you always want to feel like everyone's involved, I guess. So yeah, I do definitely feel that, and yeah, that thing about people connecting and giving that, people connecting on the stage, and then people sort of seeing that, the audience seeing that, and feeling like they're in on the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And feeling that it's kind of participatory in a way, in how that mood is shared back and amplified then by the audience. Yeah, so I wonder, kind of coming to this question, how can we use music to work more efficiently? How would you, maybe Dina, kind of answer that, or what feels like the kind of key pieces of information or maybe takeaways from some of what we've talked about today, that relate to that and that feel like, yeah, some of the key messages for working more efficiently?
Good question. We've talked about a few things. So there's something about to work more efficiently. Well, there's something about the type of music you listen to, right? And using that to influence your mood, and therefore to affect how you concentrate and how well you're able to focus on the tasks at hand. Maybe also how, like, thinking about how you listen to that. So is that through headphones? Is that a shared experience by putting it on speaker in the office? What I will say is, I saw in some research that actually it was only in the healthcare professions that people tended to find that as a useful way of listening to music, and generally in other professions it tends to be listening to music privately in headphones that is more sort of useful to productivity and focus.
Interesting. Why do you think that is?
I think there's something about people who work in healthcare professions are generally being more sort of collective. There being more of a collective sort of atmosphere, but also people who work in those sorts of professions tend to have more empathy and want to sort of experience those shared things. And also, I suppose if you're working in healthcare, you are often working in shared offices. You might talk about cases together. You might be performing surgery together if you're a doctor or a surgeon. You might have healthcare assistants and a range of different multidisciplinary teams and people who work in sort of coordination. And so it's quite helpful to be sort of on the same page already. So music might sort of support that and assist you with that. Is my assumption. So yeah, I can't remember what I was saying before now.
That's all right. I did interrupt you. I think you were
No,
saying
no.
about how different professions like to listen to music differently. So yeah, so there was the fact that then other professions we were kind of talking about how to work more efficiently, and a lot of professions actually, when listening to music, will prefer kind of in-ear music, personal music. And I think that kind of speaks to, like we were saying, the subjectivity with music and how it affects us generally. And there's some kind of interesting research as well to say that if you're more extroverted, then you tend to be naturally understimulated, which is why your performance will likely increase with background music, or these kind of minor distractions, kind of this sort of background stimulation. However, conversely, if you're more introverted, that then increases the probability that background noise, including music, will be distracting to the point of impairing your performance, because you will be naturally more stimulated in yourself. And that kind of mirrors these classic studies in psychology that shows that kind of people's extroversion score can predict how well they'll cope with sensory deprivation. Introverted people can spend much longer alone and in silence than extroverted individuals. And a lot of that is to do with this natural level of stimulation that's existing already in the body and in the mind, which I found very interesting. So we have to be able to accommodate for that when listening to music in offices or at work. So I guess as kind of some takeaways maybe for anyone who has power over these things in an office environment. So don't demonize people who are listening to music when they're working. Chances are it's helping them focus. Music we can also use in collaborative workspaces to increase focus and productivity. There tends to be types of music that will enable people to do different types of tasks. But for some people, music will not be helpful at all. They may already be quite stimulated in the mind and actually need a much quieter environment with less background noise distractions. We can also use music to create that sense of belonging among our colleagues. I found that really interesting, Dina, you were saying about this music group that you ran, because we at Elite Mind, we're kind of often looking at activities or things that you could do as a team to help create a social atmosphere and social relationships that don't rely on alcohol, because a lot of work socials and things like that can then center around alcohol, going to the pub or something like that. And I would love to see more workplaces run groups like this, where maybe each week or each month someone or a few people bring a song that means something to them. They share that song, they share what it means to them, and then hear about what other people think of that, or what that person may have gained from it or experienced from it, what it reminds them of. I think that could be a really lovely practice to bring into our offices.
I agree. There's research to show that can be helpful as well in lots of different types of office environments, and with people who do different kinds of roles and in different industries. And also, there's something about other music interventions that could be useful, like doing sort of sessions where you have like you do like percussion music sessions that are facilitated by somebody who's a music teacher, for instance. And there's another thing called Health Rhythms, which is like a drumming program. And there's some research around that as well, and how that can be really helpful in reducing sort of tension and anxiety and anger in people within office spaces. And I think that one's particularly one that was looked at for corporate professionals. yeah, the other sort of music sessions, the music group music listening could be helpful in any sort of environment as well. But yeah, because there's a range of research to show that.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that's fascinating. I would really love to hear as well, even once, if someone was watching this and not watching it live afterwards, if you have had music in your office and what experience, how you've experienced that and what you've witnessed in terms of others. Has that created any conflict? Has there been anything there that, wasn't positive with having music around? And what kind of benefits might you have experienced personally? I know that in a previous workplace that I was in, we were constantly arguing about what radio station to have on and how loud to have it on, and all of this, which in a way is kind of like a tool for collaboration in itself, sort of forces you to discuss these things and work together and compromise. But it's interesting that, when we look at workspaces, there's often can be these blanket rules, and actually 61% of offices don't permit music at all, even though over half of employees are in favor of having music. And I find that very interesting. I mean, what do you both think of that in terms of, like, what do you think is this resistance? What do you think contributes to the resistance to having music in offices?
I mean, I just get sent straight back to school do you know what I mean? Of a sense of like, give an inch, they'll take a mile kind of. Do you know what I mean? I mean, I've never worked in an office in my life, I have to be completely honest. So I can't, but it's just a sense of like giving too much. Sometimes giving too much individuality to people can find that as an issue. Not being a conspiracy theorist, it's the case, isn't it? It's why people wear school uniforms. It's why, and why people wear uniforms at work, why you have to wear a suit to work. It's the sense of in some companies, the sense of individuality is supposed to be kept at home. I think that's changing more, but I think some people find it distraction or whatever. So having some more rigid rules, I guess, maybe makes some companies think there might be more productivity. But obviously, we're questioning that now, aren't we?
Exactly. And I think that's interesting. You've kind of highlighted something there where we maybe previously associated music with personal, individual lives, and that being incompatible with professional environments. And yeah, I wonder where that comes from, whether, because music was otherwise traditionally seen as something for pleasure. We know that music has this amazing capacity to influence our brains, our moods, our states. It can make us happy, sad, energized, tired, lower our stress, increase our adrenaline, lower our adrenaline, all of this. Yet we still are kind of keeping it in this domain in our minds of personal and pleasure, rather than kind of really utilizing it as a tool in our everyday lives. And I know for myself, like, there's particular kinds of music that I'll listen to when I'm trying to do particular kinds of task, and some tasks where I won't listen to music at all, or different times of the day that I will kind of use music essentially to enhance the state that I desire, enhance the desired state, be it focus, motivation.
I mean, I think it ultimately comes back to the whole thing of like arts not being necessary. They're being like a luxury more than a necessary part of every human's existence. But I don't believe that is the case. And I think the pandemic really highlighted that for how much that was the general consensus, and B, how wrong that general consensus was, because all people were doing was listening to music, watching films, reading books. Art is one of the many things that makes life feel like life. Makes it worth living. Otherwise, what's the point? I think if you can't have those things, it's not luxury to me. It's really not luxury. It's every human deserves it whenever necessary.
Absolutely. It's kind of, you're right to kind of highlight that hierarchy that we sometimes place on industries, and seeing arts as a nice to have, and the more kind of science-based things as necessary and integral. But actually, arts make it into everything. We've just talked about how surgeons listening to music in the operating theatre increases the efficacy of their operations. I mean, if that doesn't argue the case for the necessity and impact of arts, I don't know what does.
Big time. Or political campaigns using it for poignancy in the delivery. You know, it's literally everywhere. It's everywhere.
Exactly. And that kind of the emotional trigger of it is used in all sorts of different ways. And maybe it is that association with music and emotion that then can contribute to this idea that it's unprofessional, or kind of there's a boundary there between music and workspaces.
Yeah, definitely.
What are your thoughts on that, Dina? Why do you think there's been this traditional resistance to music in offices, and how do you think that might change maybe in the future?
Well, I think to be honest, practically, and I think you touched on this earlier, Valentina. I think practically it can be hard in some offices to have music playing whilst everybody is working, especially if that's, music out loud shared, because people have different preferences, people have different needs in a working space. So it doesn't, not necessarily going to align with everybody, and could be disruptive or could cause conflict. However, I think if it was sort of implemented in the right way, or if, maybe there are periods in the day where you can have sort of music playing out loud, or you decide to have a shared music experience, or music listening experience, or excursion, or intervention even, then that could be really helpful, as long as everybody's on the same page and knows what's happening, or just encouraging people to use music as a tool to support them with their concentration and focus, and whatever they need to do. And I agree that there has traditionally been this resistance with the creative industries, and kind of marrying those, like, different types of work together, creative and the very, like, logical, scientific based sort of professions, but actually they can complement each other quite nicely, in the right ways, when done in the right ways.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to kind of highlight this actual there's lack of conflict, this complementary relationship between the industries, and actually how we do need to use different parts of our brain in different ways for different tasks, as we've mentioned. And it's the same kind of with these industries. They all fit together in a way that actually kind of encourages each of them, behind the actual creation of music, there's all of the technical engineering in creating an instrument. And then kind of conversely, then with say in engineering or science, or these more sort of technical professions, music can be used to enhance the creativity around idea generation, collaboration, focus, all of these things that we've talked about, and expression, and also kind of just serving as a backdrop as well to create the emotion around the experience, or to encourage the emotion around the experience. And that can be really necessary in careers and jobs where it might be quite emotionally stimulating in either positive or negative ways. There might be a higher need for us to use music to kind of balance or manage those extremes of emotions. Like you mentioned, Dina, kind of the classical music in McDonald's. I'm sure a lot of the workers there appreciate the calming effect on middle of the night customers that has, because it actually improves their experience of work because of how it affects then the people that they're working with.
I think if a fight does break out as well, it's way more cinematic if they can.
I would agree. It's true, it's kind of gives it a narrative arc in a way.
There you go. Exactly.
Amazing. Well, on that note, thank you both so much for joining me today. I think this has been really fascinating. We've kind of jumped around in different topics and kind of really covered quite a wide span of perspectives on music here and work, and our well-being. And I think that there's some really useful tools that we can take away from this learning. Dina, you've taught us to kind of how we might manage our own emotions using music, also about how we can connect with others and create collaborative spaces using music. Cameron, you've given us some of this insight around what it is actually specifically about the music that can create these emotional states of tension or release, but also what it's like as someone who creates and plays music in that industry, and how you experience working very much within that world. I think there's lots of tips that we've come across as well in this, with how we can use music not just therapeutically, but also in office settings to increase productivity, collaboration, reduce stress levels, and all of the above.
Indeed.
So thank you very much.
Thanks, Bea.
Thank you.
It's been wonderful. And for anyone who has been watching this, feel free to ask questions in the chat afterwards. And either for me or for Dina or Cameron, and we'll be able to answer them and get back to you later. All right. Thanks very much. Until